Hello, my name is Mads Lund. I'm a virtual effects supervisor and technical director from Copenhagen, Denmark. Sometimes when we get a client in for a review session, maybe the DOP or the director, we'll get asked maybe could you add some blue to the shadows? And I'll create a grade node and go into the lift. We usually do that and then try to add some blue, but nothing really happens. And that's a bit of a problem when you sit with a client who has, the time is precious and you really don't want to mess around with too much. The other problem is that if they ask, could we add a bit of, blue to the highlights here? So I'll go into the gain and add some blue to the highlights. And what happens is that the whole image will get darker. And then the client will say, oh, well, that's not what I wanted. I wanted just the highlights to get a little bit more blue. And of course I can fix that by using the mix luminance slider. However, the problem is that once I use the mix luminance slider, I can no longer control the gain, or the power of the gain, that is. So if the client then says, can we make it a little bit brighter in the highlights? I cannot do that. So then I will have to create another grade node and have to shuffle between those two nodes in order to control the power and control the color and which is first and so on. So that can be a bit messy, that is. So I created a tool set for us so that we can do grading on look dev and do review sessions inside sort of an interface that is much more familiar to many of those people, like the DOP. Maybe they know these stuff from the grading tools like DaVinci. We also have DaVinci suite at my place. So what we have here is if the client says, okay, let's add some blue to the shadows, then we can add some blue to the shadows, and it will only add blue to the shadows. And we can control the actual power of the shadows individually. And the same go for the highlights. If we want some blue into the highlights, we can add some blue into the highlights while maintaining the overall luminance of the image. And that's really important because you can always, adjust the contrast afterwards. Another cool thing we have added is the grading space, which is quite, I guess most people are not familiar with this. That is, you can grade in different color spaces. It doesn't really change the color space of the image, but changes the space that the color gradation is applied. So for those of you who know lift gamma gain, usually that's applied in a linear fashion. But if you apply it maybe in sRGB, you can see here that if I add a bit of blue, it's somewhat responsive. If I do it linearly, it's very, very responsive, and maybe too much actually. And if you do it like in ProTune, you'll get very, very subtle down here in the shadows, while in the highlights it'll be a little bit different, right? So it sort of gives a little bit of extra tweaking here. So I really like to do grading in Gamma 2.4 because it's quite good in both in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights here. Another thing is I have hotkeys for these guys, so I can, if I change things a bit too much, I can just hit middle mouse button and they will reset. And that's good when you sit with a lot of different changes and you just want to, let's just start over. We can just easily reset them. We also have the other hotkeys, like if I hold down Alt, it'll just move directly with the mouse cursor. If I don't do that, it will do relative, which is quite nice. And we can also, if we maybe do some changes to just the left here and then do to the gamma, then I can disable the left by just hitting the left button here, and then it's only the gamma change. So if I do changes to the left, gamma, and gain, and I can just say, okay, I just want to see what does the gamma do, and then I can re-enable those two again. This is quite nice. So we also have the shadows, midtones, and highlights. And if you go into the color correct node inside Nuke, by default it will have ranges that sort of a tiny shadow area, a huge midtone area, and a smaller mid-sized highlight area. LUE kind of does this by default, so you get equal shadows, midtones, and highlights, and I find that much more pleasing than the other way around. So if we just go through some of the other features here, we have a black point, white point, and an offset. And that's sort of what you used to see inside a grading node. Another thing we have is exposure, and exposure is defined in stops. So if you go up one, it's just one stop. That's usually what the DOP and the director knows about. So we just go stops. That's good. We have a temperature slider here, so we can go if they want it to be a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer. We could add some tint, so over here, or maybe some green. There's a contrast. This is not the regular contrast. I mean, the regular contrast inside Nuke will, it's a linear contrast, which is quite nice, I guess, if you want to do that. But in most cases, linear contrast, it clips the highlights and clips the shadows, and you rarely want to do that in a grading environment. So much rather just have, you know, a smooth shoulder and a smooth toe. So that's what the contrast here does. It does add, you know, it softly rolls off the shadows and the highlights, which is quite nice. The other thing we have is saturation, which is just like the saturation node. And the last thing is vibrance. And vibrance, it sort of adds, unlike saturation, it just increases the overall saturation of the image. Vibrance will only increase, or will increase saturation in less saturated areas. So the more saturated it is, the more saturated it will become, I guess you can say. Inside the secondaries tab, we have some different features. We have, for example, the spread toning effect, which is good for creating like, you know, retro Instagram-like effects where you know, make it look a little bit, you know, cross-processed, or what do you call it? So it's quite easy to add some, you know, a bit of flavor. It's good for look depth, for example. We have, you know, saturation, hues, and contrast for the apply method here. So it's quite nice. The other thing we have is the primary offset, and that's something I've been working on quite a bit to get the matrices, the color matrices right, to get the equations fairly good. So the first one is color shift, which will shift the colors. For example, the red here will shift it towards blue or towards green, and the same thing goes for the other colors. And we also have a color override, which will override the colors. You should look through this through a color wheel to actually see what it does. But it's it can do some fairly cool effects if you're doing like motion graphics, 3D effects where there's no skin tones or no organic things like trees and so on, where you know the colors of. You can create some really cool stylistic effects just using these. And the last one is YCBCR rotation, which will rotate the CB and CR around their center. It can create some quite interesting effects as well. And this is mainly for look depth. I rarely use that in grading sessions. Well, maybe I would use some grading sessions. I would probably do something like, you know, add a bit of green in here, so that maybe, you know, something like this, and then inside the blue I'll probably add a bit more, like 45 here, and the red not so much. But then I get a problem with, you know, a bit too teal in the skin here, or the fur. So I will maybe just, you know, warm up the colors. So something like this, and then I'll just, you know, increase the contrast a bit here, like gamma down, and then increase the gain a bit, and you know, something like this, which you see when you see the original and the final, sort of really stylistic effect. Other things we also have is the color mixer. There is a color mixer built into Nuke. If you don't know, that's the crosstalk. But the crosstalk node is really confusing. I mean, from a math point of view, it really makes a lot of sense, but actually using it is a whole other story. It's a bit complicated to work with, I think. So it's much easier to just have it laid out like this, where you can see, okay, what if we want to add a two-strip process effect? So we just add, you know, put the green into the blue channel and some blue into the green channel, and then if we just disable all the others, you can see it. Let's just add this one back on, like that. So now we have a 2-strip effect, just like that. Usually this is real time. It's just because of the screen recording software taking all the performance. But yeah, you get the idea. So if we just put this back on again and enable these guys. Like that. Then we got the hue correct. Actually, just disable these for now. Like that. The hue correct is, or hue shift, that is you know, like DaVinci. So if I have like the green leaves up here and I want to create something that looks a bit more like fall, I can take the hue and just reduce it a bit here. So just to put it over to a bit more brown color, maybe a bit too much here, like that. So now we go from something that's, you know, something that's green and lush to something that's more brown and fall like. Or we could go the other way and maybe add a bit more summer-like effect. So put a bit more green into the to the trees there. Another thing you can do is if you want to create maybe winter effect, you can take the saturation of those set colors and just reduce them, and that will sort of, you know, make it a little bit more like winter time. And you can do that for luminance and saturation and so on as well. The other thing we have is black and white, which is good if you want to create a stylistic black and white. I mean, black and white is not just black and white, just desaturation, but I mean, you can actually, you know, control the different colors. So if you have, maybe you have the a person, you have some skin tones, and you want to, you know, make the skin tones pop, then you could take all but the reds and the yellows, just sort of in the skin tone spectrum, and then just reduce everything else, and that will sort of make everything dark except for the skin tones, and that sort of makes the skin pop, which is a really nice effect if you're going to make some, you know, old noir style movie. So that's a good tip. Other than that, we also have vignettes. Use that from time to time. You know, we have an additive vignette, which, you know, will mathematically, you know, add or, you know, it's like a gain control, this one. And the other thing is vignette over. It's just like an overlay effect. So the color will be applied evenly across both the blacks and the whites. So it's good to have both of them. And inside the effects we have, for example, sharpen. You know, if you add a sharpen inside Nuke, many people don't do that, because if you do that, you will end up with something that looks like this, where you get some very nasty black edges around, you know, everything. It looks horrible. But the sharpen inside LUE is much more pleasing. As you can see, this is the sharpen from LUE, and this is the sharpen from Nuke. LUE, Nuke, LUE, Nuke. So much more pleasing sharpen effect. The other thing is grain. I mean, we rarely do colored grain when we do look dev or things like that. So we just have this monochromatic grain that doesn't have any color to it. Just, you know, just adds a bit of texture to the image, which is quite nice. That thing we have is mist. It's, I mean, rarely use mist, but sometimes it actually works. So we have it in there just in case, because if you just do mist, just a little bit of blur, it's going to look horrendous. So I spend a little bit more time making this working a bit better. So that's sort of, you know, LUE in a nutshell. And I really hope you like it. So thanks for the watch, and enjoy.